Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Hollis Institute Galleries for this evening's event, Women and Gender Studies Intersections, Namsa, Leuba. We're delighted everybody could come out here to the gallery this evening, and likewise, I'd like to welcome our online audience who are streaming this event. Namsa Leuba's work on display here in the gallery, of course, is the center point for this conversation. And it's co-presented by Women and Gender Studies and the Hollis Institute. Namsa's work, as you see, and as will be discussed, is about depictions of the other in places as far afield as sub-Saharan Africa and the South Pacific. And she's particularly interested in ways in which her work challenges the medium of documentary photography as a way through which ideas about the cultural other are created and furthered. This evening's event will proceed as follows. We'll have our panel here, and afterwards we'll have some time for Q&A. We have some microphones, just like this one, here in the gallery space, and so if you have a question, we'll be happy to give you a microphone and have you ask that question of the panelists. And for folks following us online, please notice that below the streaming feed here, there's a dialog box that you can type any questions you may have into, and we'll relay those questions to our panelists. I'd like to thank most sincerely Women in Gender Studies, the director, Kris Welde, who's here as a moderator on the panel, and so to my esteemed colleagues, Dean Kameelah Martin, Dr. Mary Trent, and Dr. Hollis France. The Crossed Looks exhibition is on display over the course of the next 2 months. It closes on December 11th, which is exactly 2 months from today. And so I'd like to invite anybody who's not been to the gallery space thus far to please come and view the startling photographs that Namsa Leuba has for us here. If you've been already, I'm sure you'd be anxious to come back and see it one more time. The Hollis is open between the hours of 11 to 4, Monday through Saturday, with extended opening hours on Thursday through 7 p.m. So please put Crossed Looks on your calendar for this fall semester. One final note is that there's an events tab on the Hollis website, which is hollis.cfc.edu, and you'll see on that events tab that we have further programming in conjunction with this exhibition, and I hope you'll check in and indeed come and continue the dialogue and the conversation around Crossed Looks over the course of the fall. If you're in the gallery space, guys, I've got to remember to do this myself. Please, let's silence our phones. But without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Kris Welde, who will introduce the panelists, and we'll get started. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. It really is a pleasure to be here and to be commencing the first of hopefully many WGS intersections at the Hollis Institute for Contemporary Art. The framing of intersections is really rooted in women's and gender studies positioning as a discipline that's at the intersections of many other disciplines. We're an interdisciplinary field of study, informed and informing academic areas ranging from classics to history to biology and public health. Women's and gender studies also explores the intersections of identities and how our varying positionalities shaped and are shaped by our lived experiences. In this way, Namsa Leuba's work, situated at multiple intersections of performance, documentary, and fashion, as well as geography, culture, and spiritual practices, and also informed by her intersecting identities as a Ghanaian and Swiss woman photographer, is really the ideal catalyst for the new series, WGS Intersections at the Hollis. We are intentionally holding this event on Indigenous Peoples Day. The traditional holiday, known as Columbus Day, has formally marked for over 80 years a problematic and fraught history of settler colonialism and intended erasure of Indigenous peoples themselves, their diverse cultures, spiritual practices, languages, and their contributions. Reframed as a day to celebrate and to honor Indigenous peoples and indigeneity, those of us who are settlers, uninvited guests, can participate in the process of holding ourselves accountable by understanding the need for such a day of remembrance and celebration. And while Leuba's work is not in and of the Americas per se, we can engage with her work on the terms that require us to identify, suspend, and upend our positionalities. We join Leuba tonight in centering those who have been erased and displaced physically and culturally, and shift to making space for resistance and resilience, particularly as those themes of resistance and resilience manifest through this spectacular exhibition. In that spirit, please join me in acknowledging that we are here in Charleston gathering on stolen lands that are historically and today stewarded by people from the Edisto, Santee, Yamasee, and Nachikuso nations, among others. We are also on land stewarded by the Gullah Geechee peoples, descended from West and Central Africa, who cultivated the rice, indigo, and Sea Island cotton plantations of the lower Atlantic coast. In so acknowledging, we can contribute to recentering the complex histories of enslavement and resistance, of genocide and survival, while simultaneously supporting current efforts for fuller truths, self-determination, and sovereignty. Join me also in acknowledging that we are gathering in an institutional space that is made possible through stolen labor in addition to stolen land. The College of Charleston itself, adjacent to the ports where at least 40% of all enslaved people were trafficked, bought, and sold, was built by enslaved peoples whose successors were, until 1967, actively banned from attending the college. This land and labor acknowledgement is but one step in the accountability imperative that shapes Indigenous Peoples Day. It is also part of building respectful, reciprocal relationships that honor our history and our past, an ethos that seems to guide Leuba's work. In fact, Namsa Leuba offers us an invitation to explore the liminality of past and present, of reality and fantasy, to embrace these images and the stories they tell as a means for liberation from the colonized, violent, and effacing practices and perspectives towards alternative narratives and futurities. My esteemed colleagues will offer their interpretations of Leuba's work from cross-disciplinary perspectives. They will share how their scholarly work informs their readings of Leuba's artistry and simultaneously is inspired by it. Just as Leuba's work assails the senses, these intellectual powerhouses here will challenge us all to think and rethink, to look and relook, to transcend our own crossed looks. We will begin by hearing from Dr. Kameelah Martin, Professor of African American Studies and Dean of the Graduate School at the College of Charleston.
Thank you, Kris. So this will be a little awkward as I hold down the button to speak. But I want to start by introducing a concept that I'm working on that's thank you. That I'm working on and is really guiding the way that I've approached looking at Leuba's work. And so this idea I am terming conjure feminism. Along with Kenitra Brooks and Lakeisha Simmons, two other Black feminist scholars, we are referring to conjure feminism to describe an ancient tradition of wisdom and spiritual practice among Africana women. It is an evolving theory of Black women's intellectual legacies of spirit work, by which I mean divination, healing practices, dream interpretation, herbology, that informs their everyday existence, from childbearing to foodways and material culture to folklore, gardening, and even death practices. So to our minds, conjure feminism first privileges African diasporic women's knowledge and folkloric practices of spirit work as their communal intellectual property. Okay? We see conjure feminism as a type of activism. Spiritual systems such as root work, Obia, conjure, vaudou, candomblé, palomayombe, and others are understood as freedom practices and sources of community empowerment. We think most importantly that it is ancestral work that creates genealogies of knowledge and other ways of knowing that are inherited, transmitted, and bequeathed orally among women of African descent. And so we are positioning conjure feminism as a type of theory. So then we understand Black women as the theoreticians. Conjure feminist foremothers include historic figures known for their spiritual and healing prowess. You may have heard of Tituba, the Salem witch trials, Queen Nanny of the Windward Maroons, Ya Asantewa of Ghana, Marie Laveau, historic voodoo queen of New Orleans, but also our grannies, my granny, perhaps your granny, your grandmother, great-grandmother, your auntie, madrinas, mambos, santeras, and other women who continue to do this work. So it's not just those who were captured in the historical record. So whether embedded in the oral tradition of telling stories or in the cinematography of series like Queen Sugar, Horton Spillers and Marjorie Price argue that, quote, however fleetingly history recorded their lives, there exists a women's tradition handed down along female lines. I only dare to offer a name for it and to advance the intellectual and intertextual discourse around conjure feminism. So there's little question about whether conjure feminism has infiltrated and informed Black women's creative endeavors. But allow me to explicate exactly how and where we see it manifesting in contemporary creative works. Everything Black women create, from quilting, beading, and body adornment, to hair braiding, dance, song, narrative, and visual art, bears evidence of conjure feminism. If conjure feminism is the philosophy through which to name Black women's ancient intellectual traditions, then conjuring moments and Black feminist voodoo aesthetics are the creative application of such. A conjuring moment is an identifiable point in a text where conjuring or African-derived ceremonial practices occur and advance the narrative action. Black feminist voodoo aesthetics is a term I coined to convey what I see occurring in Black women's artistic production. I define it as the inscription of African ritual cosmologies on the Black female body, which become manifest in the performance of ceremony, the inclusion of sacred objects or accoutrements on the body, the use of the body as a vessel for spirit, and a variety of other expressions of Africanized religious and spiritual belief. We know that Black women's literature is ripe with passages and characterizations of conjure feminist women and the spirit work used to help them to self-actualize, right? We can all call to mind Toni K. Bambara, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, and so forth. The conjure feminist lore cycle has found its way into other forms of artistic expression as well. Katherine Dunham's performance and choreographic legacy is deeply based in Afro-Caribbean ritual movement and gendered folk dance. Kara Walker's Night Conjure and Keys to the Coop, two paintings, signify on Black women's spiritual agency under the duress of slavery. And even the lyrics and accompanying music video from Nandami by Riva Neri Presil is another example of Black feminist voodoo aesthetics at work. In fact, the songstress body is literally inscribed with a tattoo of the sacred Veve of the Loa Erzuli. So I'm going to move forward a little bit. So I talk a little bit about film, and I point to Julie Dash and Casey Lemon's films, Daughters of the Dust and Eve's Bayou, as another example of where we see conjure feminism coming to fore. Then I transition to talk a little bit more about Beyonce's visual album, Lemonade and Black is King. Then I'm going to get to Leuba's work. So Beyonce Knowles Carter more recently entered the arena of Black feminist voodoo aesthetics with her visual albums, Lemonade in 2016 and Black is King in 2020. Beyonce's global popularity and reputation as a deeply involved, visionary entertainer made it possible for her to engage in this particular style of Black woman-centric narrative without apology. Lemonade pays homage to both Dash and Lemons by reprising the images of Black women sitting in tree branches, donning vintage white attire, with the Southern Gothic landscape of Louisiana Bayou as the backdrop. She intentionally invokes Dash and Lemon's visuals and the narrative forms that have become synonymous with Black women. She signals to her audience that she, too, is among the community of conjure feminist inheritors. So moving forward, I pose the question, why does it matter that we define and name the narrative and artistic style employed by Africana women artists? For one, the use of Black feminist voodoo aesthetics and conjuring moments demonstrates engagement with and an activation of ancestral memory. It, like passing along lineages in the poetic performance of the griot, ensures that Black women's knowledge and ancient wisdom continues to be disseminated and affirmed in the contemporary moment. This wisdom evolves and changes with migration, modernization, and adaptation, to be sure, but it also marks the user. The artist, novelist, filmmaker, horticulturalist, midwife, caretaker, they all make themselves known as an inheritor among the beloved Black woman community by signaling conjure feminism artistically, giving those within no cause to inquire, as the old folks say, who your people. The use of African spiritual iconography and symbolism in creative and visual art advances Black women's representation in visual media, a Herculean task. It also rejects Western cultural supremacy and privileges African-centered cosmologies in which dichotomies of good and evil, male, female, sacred and secular are not mutually exclusive, but rather two sides of one coin. Particularly for Black women, the use of conjure feminism as a theory of survival amplifies Black women's folk practices and other ways of knowing as valid, valuable, and venerable. As the folk expression taunts, what is understood doesn't have to be explained. The usage of a conjure feminist ethos and Black feminist voodoo aesthetic and Black women's visual artistry expands the indecipherable doublespeak, or signifying, for which Black diasporic women folk have come to be known. Voodoo aesthetics, I argue, are akin to a visual nation language, to use Edward Kamal Brathwaite's terminology. He explains, nation language is the language in which is influenced very strongly by the African model, the African aspect of our New World Caribbean heritage. English it may be in terms of its lexical features, but in its contours, its rhythm and timbre, its sound explosions, it is not English to a greater or lesser degree, end quote. Through visual signs such as indigo-stained hands, a yellow dress, a deluge of water, a haint blue being, the Yoruba Ori body paint, and raffia-covered egungun masquerades, Black women artists named here are speaking across, through, and under the radar of Western patriarchal, Christian, and colonized understandings of the world. Black women specifically carried on about Lemonade's subtext for months after its premiere because Beyoncé was communicating directly to them in words, symbols, experiences, and knowing that was only accessible to them. Black is King is similarly unknowable to those who lack fluency in African philosophies of spirituality and religion. And less has been published on it, I suspect, because typical viewers lack the range of the conjure feminist, voodoo, African aesthetic with which Beyoncé is speaking. This exemplifies my point about Black feminist aesthetics functioning as a visual nation language. And I believe that Crossroads, the same is true for Cross Looks. Leuba focuses on African traditions, styles, practices, and postures to capture a look that is multivocal. Her photography emphasizes her fluency in African cultures while also flexing an awareness of how those same signs have come to symbolize a single view of the continent and its people in the West. She is the trickster, toying with our visual registry, conveying different messages dependent on the positionality of the viewer. To conclude, conjure feminism derives from Black women's intellectual traditions that evolved from oral transmission. Brathwaite contends this is where nation language finds its true meaning among the in group. Quote, the oral tradition demands not only the griot, but the audience to complete the community. The noise and sounds that the maker makes are responded to by the audience and are returned to him. Hence, we have the creation of a continuum where meaning truly resides, end quote. The visualization of conjure feminism enacts a symbolic call and response of meaning between the artist and the fluent audience. It is transmitted in the common language of color, lighting, symbols, and other cinematic techniques. That would be the English. But the space where the meaning truly resides, I argue, is the experiential knowledge and spiritual practices of Black women, the anything but English. So I leave you with the question, how fluent are you?
Thank you, Dr. Martin. And next we will hear from Dr. Mary Trent, who's Assistant Professor of Art History in the School of Arts at the College of Charleston.
Thank you, Kris Welde and Mark Long and the Halsey for organizing and hosting this panel and exhibition, and to Kameelah Martin and Hollis France for joining me in conversation. But also thanks to the audience for coming, including my students who are here tonight. I'm going to speak a bit about the social historical symbolism of Leuba's use of bold color in her photographs and her reworking of Paul Gauguin's colorful colonialist paintings in her series Illusions. Leuba makes photographs that are at least partially documentary, but she does not follow the general trend in social documentary photography of rejecting color for black and white imagery. There's a strong history of black and white social documentary photography that many contemporary photographers choose to continue, like Sheila Priebe-Wright, whose work you see there on the right, who's been documenting Black Lives Matter protests for several years and whose work was actually shown here at the Halsey for the Southbound exhibition. That photograph is one of the ones on the walls here in the show. And she has other series that are done in color, but for her social documentary photography of Black Lives Matter, she chooses to tie into that long history of black and white being the preferred choice for exposing truthful, serious, hard-hitting, and gritty reality. In fact, many newspapers only very recently added color to news photography, often many decades after they were printing color photographs for advertisements. The New York Times was one of the staunchest holdouts, and that gave it its name, the Gray Lady, with it only beginning to publish news photographs in color in 1993, very gradually introducing it with only in 1997, it actually having its first cover color photograph, which you might note isn't like a political photograph or investigative journalism, but a sports photograph, so it was a slow, gradual, painful process. Now, mass color imagery had existed in advertisements and comics for more than a century before the New York Times adopted it for news photographs. But it was primarily used in advertisements, like trade cards, like the image you're seeing on the left, and in comics. And due to this long history, that influenced the association of color photography with manipulations, fantasies, and untruths of advertising, and with the crudeness and low culture of comics. That suspicion of color in mass printing and photography also related to earlier Enlightenment and neoclassical art historical beliefs about whiteness in art and architecture, visualizing a rational, restrained appreciation of beauty. And in contrast, too much or too bold use of color was seen as uncivilized and even primitive. Johann Winkelmann, author of History of the Art of Antiquity, found the epitome of beauty in the pure white marble sculpture of ancient Greece and Rome, noting, "A beautiful body will be all the more beautiful the whiter it is." During the colonialist era in which he was writing, this belief aligned with feelings about the superiority of Western culture with its presumed rational civilized restraint, in contrast to the supposedly less civilized cultural productions of colonized people. But Winckelmann's appreciation of the beauty of classical statues was based on a false premise. As more recent scholarship has shown, classical statues were originally painted with vibrant colors and flashy patterns. And not just the male statues, but also the female ones, with this example here, the original on the left, and then a recreation showing the colors that would have originally been painted on it in the classical era. In her photographs, Leuba self-consciously employs color as beautiful. This image is from the NGL series Next Generation Lagos, and it photographs Nigerian models in clothes by Nigerian fashion designers. Leuba creates a warm pink background in this image, dresses the model in a colorfully patterned shirt and woven hat, and then paints his face. We have yellow across the profile with contour lines of black across the chin and cheek, and also on the eyebrow, and then these splashes of expressionistic blue across the cheek, at the tip of the ear, and then just at the line of the nose. So her photograph connects the colored light of photography in the background with the painterly makeup on the face, and the colored patterns of fabric, connecting the media of photography, painting, and textiles in a shared appreciation of beautiful, colorful expression. Leuba is also self-conscious about her deviation from the long-standing tradition of using black and white in social documentary photography. In her Illusions series, which is right next door in the other room, she fully paints the bodies of her subjects in unnaturalistic, rich hues. And defying the need for documentary photographs to convince their viewers that they are exposing the unvarnished truth, Leuba provocatively calls her images docu-fictions, a rather postmodern viewpoint on documentary photography that embraces the inevitability of its subjective vision. As she has stated, everything I show is a reality, not the reality. Of course, just because black and white documentary photography presents itself as revealing a clear truth doesn't mean it is actually so. Dorothea Lange's famous migrant mother image on the left from the Depression era, in fact, visualizes Florence Owens Thompson, who historians later tracked down, a Cherokee woman born on tribal lands in Oklahoma. Dorothea Lange did not spend a long enough time with her subject to get any of her background or history, and it was only later historians in the 70s who in fact revealed that this famous image of suffering white motherhood from the Depression, in fact, had a more complicated story of identity. Leuba's photographs acknowledge that the truths that seem so apparent in a photograph can actually be fictions. For Leuba's Illusions series, she recreated works that had originally been paintings made by the important French avant-garde artist Paul Gauguin, a man who abandoned a career as a stockbroker to pick up painting, becoming famous for his radical, unnaturalistic color choices and an important influence for the development of Fauvism, a movement whose title identified these colorful French painters as wild beasts due to their color choices. Gauguin's most boldly colored works were inspired by a trip in which he left Europe for Tahiti in a desire to escape civilized propriety and reconnect with more authentically primitive existence. In Tahiti, he quickly left the capital where he first arrived, seeking out less populated and westernized areas. There, he became involved sexually with several young women who he depicted in his art and wrote about in his journals as sexually free and uninhibited, presumably unlike his wife, who he had left back in France. He would later share this art and publish his illustrated travelogue in France. Gauguin primarily took as his subjects vahines, the Tahitian word for women. Leuba, in contrast, updates Gauguin's paintings with mahu and rere. These are also Polynesian terms and refer to gender-variant individuals. Mahu was first recorded in the 18th century colonialist accounts of European visits to Tahiti as a term for effeminate men who were respected within the community as members of a so-called third sex. Rere developed in Polynesian languages in the 1960s as a term for trans women once male-to-female medical transitions became possible. So you can see here the similarity between Leuba's work on the right, where she's updating and transforming one of Gauguin's famous paintings. And his painting depicts two nude young women who have just gotten out of a bath, and this was an event he supposedly actually saw, where they were gossiping about their sexual exploits from the night before while lounging unashamedly in the nude. And one of them said to the other in Tahitian, "Are you jealous?" So Gauguin paints that painting, which he then exhibits back in France, and he transcribes the Tahitian, "Are you jealous?" But then where that originally was this provocative question between the two women, it really becomes Gauguin's question to his presumably French male audience, "Are you jealous? This is what I have had access to by escaping France and going to Tahiti. Don't you wish you had had what I had had?" Now, Leuba takes that, but she switches the subjects from the vahine to mahu, and she also changes the title to La Détente, right? And, you know, a détente is when you have two, conflicting parties that are able to come to a resolution. And I sense that she is, maybe there's a détente narrative that you could imagine between the two figures, but there also seems to be a détente between her and Gauguin, that she has been able to take this colonialist imagery and update it into a more inclusive expression of LGBTQ plus identities. So here's another pairing of a Gauguin painting on the left and a Leuba photograph on the right. And Gauguin often positioned his women subjects with fruit. These, ripe things that are pleasing to the senses, that are ready to be plucked. And Leuba does that as well. But you might notice that Gauguin's woman here in this, vibrant, deep purple dress, she doesn't meet the viewer's gaze, right? She's an object for the viewer's pleasure. But Leuba's subject does very directly meet your gaze, inviting you to appreciate her beauty and sensuality. Leuba interviewed her subjects before photographing them. She really wanted to get to know them and their stories. Many had hard stories of family rejection, economic hardship, and abuse, especially the Rere women. And other social documentary photographers had even photographed some of them before, but had done so in a way that emphasized their marginalization, disempowerment, and victimization. Leuba instead wanted to show them, quote, as they would want viewers to see them, as having beauty on the inside and out, and they really reflect a collaborative empowerment between her and her subjects. So finally, another pairing here again, Gauguin on the left, Leuba on the right. Though Gauguin would paint wild colors in the shadows, on the fabrics, and in the landscape, he did not stray from the natural skin tones of his indigenous subjects. The European association of brown skin with primitivism was too important to his message. Leuba, of course, adds bold colors to her subjects' skins. In her works, colorful skin is not unrefined, but self-consciously beautiful. Her series translates Gauguin's primitivist and sexually objectifying mythology to assert that gender-variant individuals are timeless, authentic, and beautiful.
Thank you, Dr. Trent. And next we will hear from Dr. Hollis France, who is professor and department chair of political science in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the College of Charleston.
Thank you, Kris, and good evening, everybody. So, before being drafted into Krista Wells' presentation army of presenters for this panel, I was unfamiliar with Namsa's work. So, as any curious social scientist, I therefore took it upon myself to visit the exhibit of Namsa's work on display here at the Halsey, and to witness her work and to hear directly from her via the 7-minute video about how she positions her work. Additionally, I also beefed up on her work by reading Joseph Jerkel's take on the meaning of Namsa's work to various communities. Therefore, I claim to be no expert on Namsa's work, but I found exposure to her work igniting certain parallels to my work regarding indigeneity and building solidarity with indigenous communities as an academic. I'm foregrounding this presentation in a paper I presented this June to the Caribbean Studies Association's annual meeting, where I started to interrogate my positionality as a Black, non-Indigenous Guyanese woman living and working in the United States, whose scholarship focuses on Indigenous Guyanese women and communities. And also, I continued this line of investigation on what might non-Indigenous Caribbean feminist solidarities with Indigenous people look like in a recently completed chapter for a forthcoming ontology on Indigenous geographies and Caribbean feminisms. I recognized as a point of entry for situating Namsa's work in relationship to mine regarding the centering of indigeneity. In Namsa's work, she engages in challenging dominant, taken-for-granted depictions of Africa as constantly a place of suffering, poverty, diseases, famines, and conflict. As an artist, she rejects the perpetuating and harmful colonial lenses that many of us in the West have come to, and some of us continue to, process our understanding of the African continent. Here, Namsa highlights the epistemic location of her work. Like my research with Indigenous women and communities in Guyana, I too engage an epistemic question the motives shaping the research and the kinds of analysis and conclusions made. Reflexivity as a praxis, acts as both an accountability and transparency tool to ensure that I, as the researcher, am constantly questioning and challenging dominant, taken-for-granted assumptions, practices, and ideas about Indigenous women, and to safeguard against reproducing, reinscribing, and perpetuating paradigms that enlist othering and exclusion. As such, I always return to the questions: from what spaces am I thinking from, with whom am I thinking with, and for what purpose? To this end, I recognize that my research is simultaneously theoretical and political. In unpacking the above questions, I realized that my decision to focus on the Waweta Women's Agro-Processing Enterprise, and this is basically, Waweta is an Indigenous community in the south of Guyana, and it borders on the Guyana-Brazil border. So I've worked with this community for several years. So in terms of realizing my decision to focus on the Wawata Women's Agro-Processing Enterprise, which basically is based on processing cassava, what influenced and what influenced and shaped, or what influenced and shaped the particular questions that I was asking in terms of where am I thinking from, who am I thinking with. These were influenced and shaped by three intersecting biases and omissions that feminist political economists are trying to correct regarding neoliberal gender mainstreaming assumptions about poor and racialized women's engagement in the economy. I hold a healthy skepticism of gender mainstreaming neoliberal narratives, which continue to be peddled by global and national decision makers of microfinancing schemes as the panacea for alleviating poverty, when in reality they're deepening, they're deepening poverty due to these approaches avoiding the larger questions of structural causes of poverty and gender inequality. Secondly, the privileging of capital as the central organizing principle of economic life and the reifying of the capitalist market as the only economic organizational ethic gives me pause. Again, in reality, we're reminded that the majority of poor rural women engage in non-capitalist endeavors on a daily basis. These non-capitalist engagements remain crucial to ensuring their economic actions and practices are not harming their other social relations. Thirdly, the often peddled victimization narrative accompanying neoliberal development approaches views poor racialized women as needing to be saved, denying their agency. In this vein, the diverse economies approach that I use acts as a point of entry for Caribbean feminist scholarship to activate its solidarity with Indigenous women by making space to center Indigenous ontologies and cosmologies. Increasingly, however, Indigenous scholars are reminding non-Indigenous scholars working in the area of indigeneity that when engaging in research with Indigenous populations, we need to ensure Indigenous peoples are actively engaged in the research process. This means non-Indigenous scholars must be intentional about invoking a practice of co-creating the research process with Indigenous peoples at all stages. The co-creation of the research process lends to Caribbean feminists supporting Indigenous self-determination and sovereignty regarding redressing the power imbalances produced by colonial power hierarchies of knowledge imposed. However, the steps mentioned above provide the opening and lead up to a larger, unsettling, and difficult conversation about decolonization. While it is common to see many Caribbean feminists join the decolonization bandwagon of offering to decolonize everything from methods to education as a solution towards building a better world, Tuck and Yang caution us that decolonization is not a metaphor. At its heart, decolonization is about recognizing Indigenous peoples' sovereignty and their contributions to knowledge production. Recognition of Indigenous sovereignty and knowledge contribution means joining in the struggle for the repatriation of Indigenous lands and understanding that Indigenous peoples have theoretical and methodological contributions to offer to the discourse of economic organization. Therefore, for non-Indigenous Caribbean feminists with creolized Indigenous identities who continue to engage in research on Indigenous land appropriated for plantation economies, a feminist practice of reflexivity needs to be adopted. As the descendants of African enslaved and Indian indentured labor, we became the beneficiaries through the acquisition of post-colonial state practices of displacing Indigenous peoples in the Caribbean through an extension of colonial attitudes and policies. Hence, we should be interrogating and thinking seriously about what the project of decolonization would really look like after land is repatriated to Indigenous people. And what would be the consequences for us with creolized Indigenous identities? Moving forward, Caribbean feminists should bear in mind that solidarity is uneasy, reserved, and unsettled matter that neither reconciles present grievances nor forecloses future conflict. Thank you.
I just want to say that my friends are so cool. Brilliant. Let's see if I can make a little bit of sense of some of my scribbles here. I'm going to pose what may be a rhetorical question to the panel, and then I definitely would like to open things up for questions that may be emerging here on the floor or online, and I'm getting some nods that there might be some questions. So I'm, from a women's and gender studies perspective, I have to say that I'm incredibly excited by this conversation about disrupting binaries and hegemonic narratives of gender, of sexuality, of the African continent, and exchanging these with an embrace of fluidity, with color, with fluidity of subjectivities and positionalities of ourselves and of others. I'm intrigued by this concept of fluency that Dr. Martin suggested to us. And I'm curious just how much of this fluency is needed to appreciate Leuba's work, to understand the subtext, the use of color, for example, to appreciate the subversive themes of her work, the deeply subversive themes of her work. And perhaps not just appreciating these, but applying them, learning from them, upending our own perspectives and positionalities. So Dr. France mentioned this sort of point of entry, and how is it that we contend with points of entry that lack fluency, that reinscribe colonial, white supremacist, heteronormative, neoliberal, capitalist narratives? I said it could be rhetorical. Right? I mean, if you've enjoyed this exhibition, there is a level of fluency that is needed to really appreciate what Leuba is intending to do here, and I think that our panelists really convey that, right, through their expertise, helping us understand the nuance, the subtext, and without that, how do we engage with this work? What can we say about this work?
Suppose I'll chime in. I think the beauty of thinking about this exhibit or any others as a type of visual nation language is that it does not restrict access to those who are fluent, right? I think there is still a message, I think there is still communication happening even for those who are less fluent, if you will, the message may be different. And I think that's, for me, that is the beauty of the artist, is being able to talk to multiple audiences simultaneously. For me, that's the tricksterism of it, right? Is that she's saying one thing to this community, you know, the saying that's going around these days, if you know, you know, right? But if you don't know, you can still get something very rich out of the work. And I think that, for me, is really the genius of it.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And I think the other thing none of us have mentioned yet, like her overlaps with fashion photography. And, you know, you don't really, I mean, I guess you have to have some fashion knowledge, baby, which I definitely don't have. So I probably don't appreciate the work as well on that level. But, I mean, I could see so many of these being in Vogue, which maybe she even worked with Vogue at some, I can't remember. Or she's done advertising campaigns for somebody. But, so yeah, I feel like just the appreciation of the fabrics, right, is something that I think a lot of people could get into, and just, yeah, the style of these works. Yeah, another thing we haven't mentioned yet either that I didn't even know about until I walked into the show here is this incredible hanging of the show, right? She has on the back wall like traditionally framed photographs, but then we have just works without any frame. We have things that are overlapped in unusual ways. She does these artist books as well. So I think she's even really self-conscious about the presentation and framing of the work as like, all right, I can do traditional fine art, but then I can do things that are much more out of the frame, out of the box, and reach different audiences in those ways.
So I really liked Kameelah's take on this idea of trickery. And as I walked around, as I said, I'm not an expert on this, and this was the first time I was introduced to her work. And I was walking around, and I thought to myself, in terms of the imagery that I'm seeing, this is a new kind of vibrant Africa. That's one of the things that really like struck me. So, and again, and what I, kind of referred to, kind of really stripping this kind of colonial lens, right? And the coloniality that a lot of times I think that people in the West still look at, through and think of Africa. So this was a kind of a vibrancy, and I think like her work in Nigeria is just really amazing. And the other thing, as you said, I think depending on who you are, right? And it's like that epistemic lens, right? And where you're located, how you're going to look at this, right? It's going to be based on, your knowledges that have been produced about, whether it's fashion, whether it's Africa, whatever it is. But one of the things that also kind of struck me, and as, I've read some of the notes, was this idea in terms of that she wanted to also use not models, for example, just ordinary people, and she calls them her collaborators, right? And that also kind of reminds me about this idea of building solidarity with folks, right? You're co-producing, co-creating, and here she is co-collaborating with these folks.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask if there are any questions from those who are here. If there are any questions that have emerged online.
We do have a microphone here, guys, if you'd like to ask a question. Any takers? Please.
The idea of cultural appropriation has always been somewhat problematic for me. I have Pacific Islander, Asian, and European in me, and a lot of those things have been culturally appropriated by other groups. And from what I've seen, some of it hasn't been so bad, some of it hasn't been so good. And in a way, Namsa has culturally appropriated European conventions in art to use to show us something different from another way. So I think cultural appropriation is a very wide subject, and mostly what I hear is how bad it is. You know, and I have come from a sort of a tradition where I have seen the good side of it, and I think it's a topic that needs to be slightly better thought out, other than just cultural appropriation is bad. I don't know that's a question.
Well, I think that your point is well taken. I think we certainly do have to nuance cultural appropriation, and when we're thinking about the purpose or kind of the larger context of what is being done, right? I think in Namsa's case, I think you could argue she's building on this colonial Western legacy in order to make a larger point, right? And I think a lot of the critique around cultural appropriation is, that some people are really trying to capitalize off of another person's culture without even giving any credit or engaging that community or even taking the time to even understand what the culture is that they're appropriating, right? Some people's sacred traditions get appropriated and it becomes, a point of contention because it's a religious symbol or something of that nature. So I think, yes, I think it can be used in a positive way. It can be used to bring more attention to an idea or, engage in more deeper conversation. But there's also that part of it where there's none of that critical thinking that gets applied. And I think that, for me, is the problem with cultural appropriation when it gets used just for its marketability and there's no connection to that culture, no regard for those who come out of that community.
Yeah, great question, and I'll just echo what Dr. Martin said, that I think with appropriation, there's the implication of an imbalanced power relationship. Whereas, art school is all about learning about other people's work and then blending it into a newer version, so every painter is going to learn about Paul Gauguin and try it out in one way or another. So, but we don't call that appropriation because that person has huge power in the history of art and you're an unknown art student. So you're not threatening the estate of that artist in any way, shape, or form. So I don't think we would look at it as appropriation. And even when I was able to write about this body of work for the catalog and was able to interview Namsa Leuba for that, and I asked her about Gauguin, and I was honestly kind of expecting her to just trash him in a way that certain art historians might do when they're teaching Paul Gauguin in their survey class. And she didn't. She totally surprised me. She was like, I remember when I was just beginning and painting, and my father bought me this book of these paintings because he's so huge in France, and she did not say negative things about him, I think the way she at least presented it to me was she was inspired by that, and it is hugely important in French history, but that she was doing something different.
Yeah, and I find it really interesting that anybody would say that she was culturally appropriating from the Europeans, right? To think about the power relationship there. In terms of when we talk about cultural appropriation, that usually is something that is from the dispossessed community, right? So African Americans have been talking about this in terms of, say, white Americans being able to take their culture, whether it's rap music, whether it's, in terms of hairstyles or whatever, but you're taking from a population, right? Think about it, that was stolen and enslaved, right? And in terms of robbed, right, of all of the, in terms of all the access that you can think of. And you can think, here's Namsa, right? Then turning that lens, how does one steal from the Europeans? That is the question that I would ask. And that is where I think in terms of the power relations is something you've always got to look at when you think about something like cultural appropriation.
I want to jump in with a question from an online viewer. Actually, Dr. Dale Rosengarten asks a question specifically for Dr. France. And she writes, how do you see Leuba's photos in terms of decolonization?
So here again, there's a problematic when it comes to this issue of decolonization. One of the things that, and this is something I've been struggling with, and I was even thinking about, was that an approach that I wanted to take in terms of this panel? So when it comes to decolonization and, reading like Tuck and Yang, right? A lot of this is centered also, I think, in terms of thinking about indigenous and non-indigenous people, but a lot of times in terms of the non-indigenous folks tend to be, you get the sense, especially in the literature, in the settler colonial literature, and there's a whole settler colonial studies body of literature, that the non-indigenous person is the white person. Right? So as a person of color, right? I'm a Black woman, I'm an immigrant, I'm from the Caribbean. My connection, and right, in terms of thinking about, the colonization, has been slightly kind of different to the experience, even say, of African Americans, right? And so this goes back to the whole idea, and something, thinking about like settler identities, and I know that Kris, you use that, but I have to even kind of question, right, do I quite fit in terms of that settler identity, right, given in terms of my positionality? So I find it kind of difficult to even kind of answer that question in terms of thinking about Namsa, right? Is this really in terms of engaging in decolonization when thinking about decolonization as tied towards land and the repatriation? Because remember what colonialism was all about, right? And especially in terms of the United States, it was to take people's land, right? So for indigenous people, when you're talking about decolonization, first and foremost, it's like, what are you going to do about my land? Right? So sometimes I think of this as kind of anti-colonial work. I don't know whether I would put that, and I'm still interrogating, right, of where I'm situating myself of this term of decolonization, because I think it's been used, it keeps being used very loosely. And I think there needs to be a lot more interrogation of it.
Thank you, Dr. France.
Yeah, thank you very much. Any more questions here? Anyone? I can add another question from our online viewers. And Dr. Brian, it's from Dr. Brian, and I think it's an open question that anyone can answer, but would any of you like to name your favorite piece in the show and say maybe why you were drawn to it?
I love the African queens and how she subverts that and that trickery. I love that term, trickery. Because I was thinking about that when I think, when we think about the queen, and again, a lot of these things have been kind of colonially constructed, right? We think of a queen and bejeweled, you know, and even in terms of the African queen, of what we've seen like in movies and so forth, and to see just in, you know, everyday attire, what she does with those images is just amazing.
Oh, so many. So for me, my favorite series is Wiki, that comes from Benin. And for me, it spoke to my research interest, which is the Vodun and Voodoo traditions coming out of Benin through Haiti into Louisiana. And I was just dumbstruck by that series and how she's trying to express these spiritual concepts visually. And there were some that I got right away, and there are some that I'm like, but what is she doing here? So for me, that was the series that really drew me in. But I mean, I think this one is probably my second favorite. I just think the images are stunning. The textiles and the masks and the stilts tradition. And I believe this is South Africa. I forget the name of the series, but it is in South Africa. And I mean, it's just phenomenal.
So I think my favorite series, because it's hard to pick one work, would be the ones right behind me, the Next Generation Legos. I mean, they're just beautiful. Just aesthetic appreciation. Forget, you know, history and theory. Like, that's what I would want to take home with me. But I also, I mean, I'm very intrigued by this series over here, which I don't remember what it's called. That is a series that I really don't have the cultural fluency to read, but I'm just so taken by these particular, you know, these poses. And it makes me think, with my own like background and art historical knowledge about the saints who supposedly stayed on top of columns for long periods, and you know, and I'm just interested in that whole standing on top of columns thing. That just seems very, I just want to learn more about the narratives there that I don't know about. So I would want to know the history of that series and the many references that as a trickster she is playing with. And I just wanted to echo too, that really stood out to me. I mean, there's so much that was so great in your talk, but I hadn't thought about her as a trickster, and I love that. And if I could ask you a question to speak just a little bit more about that, or maybe where you see it in a specific play of where she's playing with that, with her audience, that would be great.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'm going to go back to Benin and the images that I am most fluent in. I will definitely have to say that, you know, some of these other images I am limited in my ability to read the African cultures, but the West African focus in Benin, there are a couple. I think there's one, and I just think even the name of the image, Black JC. That's the one with the Christ-like figure on the crucifix that we don't actually see, right? It's just kind of this imposition of this man on the crucifix, but we don't actually see the crucifix. And then behind him is the Virgin Mary. What I think is interesting about that is, you know, she's kind of toying with some of these stereotypes that actually come out of Haiti, right? Haiti being a former French colony, very Catholic. And so it's toying with this Catholic iconography in association with the Vodun tradition in Benin. And the funny thing about that is, well, one, the Benin tradition is the most African. There's really kind of no place for the Catholic tradition in Vodun. We see in Haiti that the two get commingled. So I just thought it was interesting that she's kind of placing it there as kind of like this signal to what the tradition is. But if you know the difference between Haiti and Benin, then you know that Catholicism is not the stronghold. And I think furthermore, Kris pointed this out to me, that she mentions that in the Vodun tradition, they don't actually use statues, right? They don't use these these metallic, hard structures as part of the ritual. And so she's including this image there, and of course the title, Black JC, Black Jesus Christ, right? She's even kind of toying with what we know or what we think we know about voodoo and Vodun and Catholicism, and then the fact that the Christ figure is a black man, right? So she's really kind of toying with our visual registries there. So there's that one. And there's another one where it's the very last image where the young man has this platter on his head. And there's a rooster, there's a bottle of Clarin, white rum, and there are all of these other items that are sometimes used in ritual sacrifice. But in the context of that image, it makes no sense. And that was the one that just really threw me for a loop. And so it's, again, she's kind of playing with these stereotypes. It's like, I'm going to give you some of the things that you might recognize as being part of this tradition, but I'm going to completely change the makeup, and I'm going to put it on his head and, you know, have all of these dangling strings, and I'm going to make it look exotic and strange and all of these things, and make you believe that this is what voodoo is, right? But if you know, then you know that none of that actually made sense. And I was like, what is she doing? So I think she's definitely playing with stereotype and preconceived notions of what some of these traditions are.
And if I may, my favorite series is the Illusions series, which is on the other side of this wall. And in particular because of the ways in which she plays with gender and sexuality, and also centers the subjectivities of the Mahu and the Rere, as Dr. Trent was explaining to us, in direct conversation with these historical paintings. And one of the things that I read about her intention in use of color, particularly in that series, is because black and brown skin has been so exoticized, and she removes the ability for the viewer to exoticize those models, for lack of a better word, her collaborators, by painting them in these really bright colors. And so that element of suspending our ability to exoticize was just really fascinating to me once I understood the use of the color in that way.
So guys, we do have time for one more question. If anybody has a burning question they have to ask. Okay, well, if not, please stay tuned for more Women and Gender Studies Intersections events here in the Halsey over the course of coming semesters. And please join me in thanking our panelists.